Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Andrew Explains It All. I'm Andrew Conlog, and today I'm going to explain it all about a particular subject in Tucson, Southwest Arizona, history or culture, and we're both going to be better people for it. Me for the telling, you for the listening, and both of us for the learning for each other. Now, I've mentioned before that I don't really talk about politics very often, and on the one hand I don't, but then I was thinking about it, and on the other hand I sort of always do, because history is very hard to separate out from modern politics. And that's especially true in this area when you have such hot button issues surrounding this area like immigration and the border wall and things like that. And with that in context, if you're thinking about modern politics, you might wonder, can it possibly get any worse in terms of the relationship between the United States and Mexico and other things? I mean, we're at each other's throats. We have these issues with immigration. We have the border wall. We have other things going on. We have shooting of unarmed civilians by military or police authorities. We have this fake news epidemic that's gone on around all of it. We have this interchange of drugs and weapons on the US border. And you're wondering, can it get any worse? Well, as a historian, at least of the amateur variety, I'm here to tell you it can, and it has, in that the United States and Mexico have actually fought each other before. And I'm not just talking about the Mexican-American War, although that might actually be important to talk about at some point. I'm talking about a smaller episode that has to do with Tucson, or at least a town that's very near to Tucson, the town of Nogales, which is, if you're not familiar with it, is the border checkpoint crossing area that's nearest to Tucson and kind of serves this whole southwestern area. It was referred to as the Battle of Ambos, Nogales. And what exactly was that? Well, I'll tell you. So Ambos Nogales in Spanish means both Nogales says, and that's because there are two Nogaleses. There's a Nogales, Arizona and a Nogales, Sonora. And both of the communities kind of grew up together as one binational community. It was started to facilitate trade between Arizona and Sonora and the US and Mexico, kind of in the 1800s, and for a while everything was pretty great. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture or anything, but it really was one community split between two countries. There were roads that went right through both the towns, and there was no wall, and there was just free exchange of people, and it was very much one sense of one town. Now that changed, and as many local things do, it changed because of the interference of national and international politics. Specifically, at this time, it was the Mexican Revolution. And that's also something important to talk about. It's a very complicated story, so I'll only sort of gloss over it here for the context of it. So in the 19-teens, I'd guess you call them, the second decade of the 1900s, Mexico underwent a revolution, and the way it started was that the longtime, and I mean longtime, leader of Mexico, a man named Porfirio Diaz, he was a corporatist, conservative, rich, militarist type, if you can picture that. He had a bunch of medals on his shirt, if that's type of guy. And anyway, he was overthrown by a middle-class reformer guy named Francisco Madero, who very shortly after overthrowing Diaz was himself overthrown by a right-wing reactionary general named Victoriano Huerta, who was himself overthrown, and thereafter and during it was just a bloody mess. There were a lot of different factions, there were a lot of different ideologies, all of them just wanting to seize control of the Mexican state. Now, just as an example, you're probably familiar with Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was one of these guys during the Mexican Revolution. He was allied to people in the early part, and then he led his own army here in the northern part of Mexico later on. And anyway, it was just sort of a bunch of Pancho Villa types fighting each other. And you would think that with all the chaos in Mexico, the United States, or places near the United States, might be safer, but actually the opposite was true. The border was very heavily contested for a variety of reasons. Like I mentioned, Pancho Villa was from the north. A lot of people were from the north for some reason, but a lot of the border towns were heavily contested as well because they provided access to the United States of America. And like in modern times with the cartel wars that are going on, if you had access to the border, you could get guns and money and supplies. It's kind of eerie, some of these comparisons that you're about to see, and that's only the first one. But anyway, these border towns were fought over, and one of them was Nogales. There were several battles of Nogales that just happened on the Mexican side, and it was a pretty dangerous place to be. And actually, understandably, the Americans were pretty concerned about this. So Nogales became militarized. There were a lot of soldiers that came there, and they implemented a lot of new, different ways of doing things that severely curtailed that free flow of people between the two sides. And that led to a lot of animosity, because Mexicans, when they were trying to cross over to this town that was basically just another half of the town not that long ago, had all these new restrictions and all these new things they needed to do. And when they did not comply, and even when they just complied incompletely and didn't completely understand what was going on, the Americans would basically mistreat them and be mean to them. And that was a big problem. It got so bad that there were a few people that were actually killed in these interactions. One of the most famous, partly because it's so tragic, was that there was a gentleman from Sonora. He was the son of a former governor of Sonora, and just by all accounts, a very nice and kind man in his own right. But unfortunately for him in this particular situation, he was hearing impaired. He was described as a deaf mute. And he was crossing the border, and American soldiers told him to stop, and he didn't hear them because he was hearing impaired, and he was shot and killed. And this was maybe the greatest outrage in what both sides sort of perceived as a series of outrages. So this border area in Nogales was very tense. And what sort of set the whole thing off, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand moment of this Battle of Ambos, Nogales, happened in 1918. And the situation would almost be kind of comical if not what happened. There was a guy, a Mexican, who was working on the Arizona side and was crossing over to the Mexican side. He was a carpenter, and he had what I can only describe as like a comically large box that he was carrying with him. Just picture a big, almost silly-sized box, and this guy was carrying it. And he walked across the border, which again was non-existent. There wasn't any kind of real demarcation. He crossed over the border with his box, and he actually was on the Mexican side at this point when American soldiers told him to stop and come back so they could look at the box. And the guy apparently didn't mind that too much and was actually going to cross the border so they could look at the box when the Mexican border guards on their side told him to stop and do not go back across the border. You are on the Mexican side. They have no right to make you go across the border. Don't do that. So this guy who was just trying to please people basically said, okay, and started walking back towards Mexico, and the Americans jumped in again, and the American soldiers and the Mexican border guards started shouting and cussing at each other, and there's this guy with this box just standing in the middle of it trying to figure out what to do. And to be fair, no one claims to know who fired the first shot in this interaction, but somebody did, and then the fight between the two sides just became general, and that was the beginning of the Battle of Ambos, Nogales. If you're curious as to what happened to the guy, apparently he hit the deck, and then when he got the chance, he just kind of ran off into Mexico, and I don't know what happened to the box that precipitated the whole thing. But anyway, back to the fight. When the shooting started, the first thing that happened thereafter was a group of Mexicans on the Mexican side, mostly civilians, but a few soldiers, just grabbed their guns and sort of joined in and started firing on the American side. And then the Americans, hearing this, a bunch of soldiers and some armed civilians came out and they started firing on the Mexican side. And then this battle between the two sides of what was once basically a united town went on for a while, and there was a pretty high death toll. Over 100 people died, more on the Mexican side than the American side, but there were American casualties as well. Now, there were efforts to put a stop to this. Almost immediately, the mayor of Nogales, Sonora, whose office was nearby, overheard this going on and leapt right into action. He was able to kind of do up a white flag and went into the scene of the battle. But unfortunately, and we know that the shot came from the American side, although we also don't know who exactly fired that shot. He was shot and he was killed and he died immediately. Now, there were further efforts even after that. The man who was the successor to the mayor, who had been the deputy minutes before and then immediately became the acting mayor, still tried to put a stop to things. He was able to get in contact with the commander of the American forces and basically said, okay, why don't we both raise white flags and then we'll stop and we'll figure this out. To which the American commander, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Fred Herman, who I mentioned because he's going to show up later, said literally, go to hell. He told the guy to go to hell. He said that American soldiers do not raise white flags, and that if the Mexicans didn't put a stop to this unilaterally, immediately, they would go over and they would burn down the town of Nogales, Sonora. So obviously that didn't help things. But the town wasn't burned down, and eventually, after these unfortunate casualties, higher authority arrived and was able to put a stop to it. An American general from Fort Huachuca and the governor of Sonora, a man named Plutarco Elias Calles, who I only stopped to mention because he would go on to become the president of Mexico, and actually one of the most consequential presidents in Mexican history. But that was for the future. For now, he was the governor of Sonora. They kind of met and they put a stop to things. And that truce that they established largely held. Now, there were a few little incidents, like there was an incident where there was an American soldier manning a gun and some Mexicans, either from the other side or maybe they were locals over there with the passions inflamed, shot at him and hit his leg. And then he went to get his leg treated, and then he came back out and he was mad, so he started firing himself back. But anyway, all these various offenders were punished by their own sides, at least as much as possible, to show good faith, and that caused the truce to hold. And that was the end of the Battle of Ambos Nogales. Now, there's some aftermath things that are interesting. The national politics in America got kind of fascinating. A character, really a character in American history, at that time a New Mexico senator named Albert Fall. I'll mention his future too, because he was gonna become a member of the cabinet of President Warren G. Harding, who you may recognize as one of, if not the most corrupt presidents in history, or even if he personally himself wasn't the most corrupt, his cabinet was definitely one of the most corrupt. And Albert Fall was one of the most corrupt members of that most corrupt of cabinets, and he ended up getting in a lot of trouble later in his life. But anyway, at this time he was just a senator, and he instigated a whole commission called the Fall Commission, kind of a Benghazi type thing, if you can picture that, into the causes of this Battle of Ambos Nogales. And people claim that he didn't really have just the purity of truth and justice at his heart. He had a lot of oil interests, and a lot of those oil interests were in Mexico, and people say that he had an interest in inflaming things with Mexico and weakening Mexico or taking over Mexico or something like that, which is probably true given all the trouble he got into later and how dishonest, I guess, he ended up being. But anyway, he started this with this Fall Commission. And one of the people that testified before Congress was none other than Fred Herman, then a captain, because he apparently, not even because of that, or partly because of that, just wasn't very good at his job, so he got demoted. But he claimed to have seen with his own eyes while he was prosecuting this battle that there were German saboteurs that were leading the Mexicans. And horror of horrors, because we were at war, well, we weren't at war when the commission came about, but we had been at war with Imperial Germany, those dastardly folks. That was not true. That was an example of fake news, but it served that commission's purpose. And then the final unfortunate epilogue to this was, as a result of the Battle of Ambos Nogales, both sides, American and Mexican, decided that the best thing for them was to build a wall between the two sides of Nogales. And that wall was built, and that wall remains there to this day, and that wall may actually be getting a lot bigger if things happen as some people want them to happen. So with that interesting reflection of the way that history, if it doesn't repeat itself, at least does rhyme, this has been Andrew Conlog for Andrew Explains It All. I'll see you next time.